Can you play this clip? It's so interesting. When you watch this, the guy that's asking the questions is so calm and poised, and he gets rattled. Watch this.
To look at this and say the reason that the Russian army is on NATO, the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is because NATO has expanded rather than the Russians expanding? That, in other words, NATO has moved closer to Russia rather than Russia moving closer to NATO? Is that not an accurate way to look at this?
I think that's the way President Putin probably looks at it. It's certainly not the way that we look at it.
You don't think that NATO has expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO has expanded,
Okay.
and the expansion has been a good thing for...
So the reason that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is not the fault of the Russian army, it's not the Russian army that's done it. It's NATO has moved closer to, moved
I'm pretty
east.
sure it wasn't NATO who was ordering, upwards of 15 battalion tactical groups to within 10 kilometers of the border with Ukraine. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't NATO who put little green men inside Ukraine to destabilize eastern cities.
I'm pretty sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So unless that's changed,
it's not changed. But I'm pretty sure the movement by Russia is Russia's decision.
If NATO has moved east, the reason that the Russian army is closer or on NATO's doorstep is because NATO moved.
NATO is not an anti-Russia alliance. NATO is a security alliance.
Watch.
For 50 years, it was an anti-Soviet alliance. So do you not understand it? So do you not understand how, or can you not even see how the Russians will perceive it as a threat? And the fact that it keeps getting closer to their border, while their troops, I mean, the places where their troops are, you say their troops are, and may have been in Ukraine and Georgia, are not NATO members.
I'm not going to pretend to know what goes in President Putin's mind or Russian military commanders. I mean, I barely got a history degree at the University of South Florida. Right. What I can tell you is that NATO is a defensive alliance. It remains a defensive alliance.
Fair enough, but it has moved east. Correct? I mean, that's just a fact.
It has expanded, absolutely.
Right, exactly.
But there's no reason for anybody to think the expansion is a hostile, a threatening move. And we've been saying that throughout the last 15 years, man.
It's like you're moving closer to Russia. You're blaming the Russians for being close to NATO.
No.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Hagel
We're
said.
blaming the Russians for violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine and destabilizing the security situation inside Europe.
Which is not a NATO member.
I see
other countries feel threatened.
Nothing makes me happier than when you actually see a really good reporter that has the balls to do stuff like that and isn't silenced because they're scared about losing their job. I love things like that.
But that's a guy named Matt Lee, that journalist.
Good
named Matt Lee. What are your thoughts when you see that?
Well, it's obvious that they don't want you to know the real history. They don't want you to know that when Germany was allowed to reunify, the promise from NATO to Russia was that we won't expand NATO. And then, of course, it did. I think there's 13 or something more countries that they put into NATO. And now they wanted to put Ukraine into NATO or threaten to do that. That would be like if Russia got into a military alliance with Mexico and they wanted to start putting military bases in Mexico. We wouldn't allow that. We wouldn't allow it. And just like what happened in Cuba with the missile crisis in the 60s, we wouldn't allow stuff like that. But we're doing that, and people don't want you to know that this NATO is not a defensive, it is offensive. This is a war that was started and provoked by NATO and the West. Zelensky ran on peace. He ran on bringing the country back together, right? The Russian speakers in the East, the Donbass. But he didn't do it. So why? Because he got threatened by NATO and the ultra-right, the Nazis in Ukraine. And so they threaten to kill. He knows he's a dead man if he does a peace deal with Russia. So that's why he won't. And when they had a peace deal in March, and that's when Boris Johnson from the UK flew there and said, hey, you don't do this. And he killed the peace deal. So Russia is the one that wants peace in this deal, and Ukraine and NATO do not. They want to bleed Russia economically, and that's why they blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And they
allegedly,
they've always said they were going to do it, and they did it. And for the life of me, I can't get why the European nations are going along with this. They've said stuff like, there was the foreign minister of Germany said, I don't care about my people if they don't want this. I care about the people of Ukraine. What leader of a country says they don't care about their own people, but they care more about somebody else's country? It's crazy what's going on. So people don't realize that NATO has provoked this. In fact, there was a peace agreement in 2014. The CIA helped overthrow the Ukraine government. And then the people in the Donbass didn't want to go along with this coup government, right? Because the leader of Ukraine wanted to be friendlier economically with Russia instead of join like the European Union. And that they couldn't have that, right? So that's why they did a coup. And the people, the Russian speakers in the Donbass didn't want to go along with that coup. And so they kind of wanted to break away. Ukraine government started shelling the Donbass, and so they had a peace agreement called the Minsk Agreement, and that was supposed to give them independence. They were supposed to have their own elections, and they were going to stop shelling them. They never did. They ended up killing like 14 or 15,000 people in the Donbass over the last 8 years, and now it's been revealed that that peace agreement was never real. The Merkel, the former prime minister of Germany, just admitted that the only reason they did that peace agreement was to give Ukraine enough time to build up its military, so when they finally did provoke an invasion, which is what they did, that they would have a military ready to fight Russia. And so people don't know this is what happened. Mm-hmm. And so they just think that one day Putin woke up and said, I want to go invade Ukraine because I'm a maniac. And they think that he's the bad guy. They think that he's acting rationally. We always knew he would do this. In fact, we were counting on him doing this. That's why we did what we did. And they don't know that Ukraine ramped up their bombing right before the war started last year. They doubled their bombing. They were really trying to provoke it, and they did. And they provoked it. And the Russia would rather have a peace agreement. The rest of the world would rather have a peace agreement. Not NATO, not Joe Biden, not the military-industrial complex. And so that's where we are. And people don't know that, and that's what that is. That guy's saying, hey, NATO's the ones expanding. The reason why, he said it, the reason why that NATO's army is on the doorstep of Russia is because we moved, not Russia. And it's just obvious that we're the bad guys. The United States are the world's terrorists. We have 1,000 military bases. We have 400 military bases surrounding China since the Korean War. We just added 3 new military bases in the Philippines. They just announced 2 weeks ago. This is how all empires end. We're overextending militarily while we have people living under every bridge. People don't have health care, a living wage. Half the country can't afford a $500 emergency. 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. 50% of wage earners earn $30,000 or less. People go bankrupt when they get sick in this country. We have homeless people everywhere, and that's because our government is 100% corrupted. It's the people think that it's corrupted like, oh, Joe Biden gave his kid a no-show job on a Ukraine energy board, or Donald Trump gave his kid a deal with the Saudi. No. That's regular corruption. I'm talking about 100%. Everything the government does, it only does it because of corruption. And that's the only way the wheels get greased is through corruption. That's why we can send $100 billion to Ukraine without any oversight, and we still won't send it to our own cities to fix our homelessness or our bridges that those homeless people are living under. We won't even fix our own goddamn country. So people don't realize that this is pretty much a banana republic. We're at the end. This is the end of this empire. We're basically Brazil with a couple of big cities that are keeping it afloat.
You think so?
Yeah.
You believe that?
Yes. Yeah. Well, when half the country can't afford a $500, this is what I like to say. What do you call a system that takes the richest country the face of the earth has ever seen and renders half of its population poor or low income? You call that a failed system. And that's what we're living in. And people think we're going to be able to vote our way out of this. What we have to do is get people in the streets. So when someone like AOC has 13 million Twitter followers and Bernie Sanders has, they're supposed to tell people to get in the streets, shut stuff down, protest, and take our government back. But they won't because they're part of the system. And that's what I'm trying to wake people up. It's worse off having people like Bernie Sanders and AOC in the Democratic Party in government, even though Bernie claims he's an independent. He's a Democrat. And why is it worse? Because it gives people the false impression that there's somebody actually fighting for you in government, and there isn't.
So okay.
And the only way you can have change and get people into the streets is when they lose faith in the system. And we have to get them, we have to disabuse them of the idea that there is somebody fighting for them in this system, and there isn't.